Inside the Albany Houses in Crown Heights on October 20th, 1987, Kelvin Martin stepped into a dim stairwell beside someone he trusted from his own circle. He moved easily that night, calm in a way people later said didn't match his usual habits, since the bulletproof vest he often wore stayed upstairs in his girlfriend, Precious Golston's apartment. As they made their way down from the higher floors toward the landing, nothing about the moment looked tense, which made what followed hit even harder once shots rang out in that narrow concrete space. Kelvin dropped after being hit in the head, chest, and stomach, while the man beside him stood right there through it all, which left one detail hanging heavier than everything else. What makes this different is who pulled the trigger. Once word spread across Brooklyn that Kelvin Martin had been shot again, people didn't react with shock the way outsiders might expect, since by the mid-80s his name already carried stories that sounded unreal but kept proving true over time. Over several years, he had been caught in at least 9 separate shooting incidents, with reports placing the total number of bullet wounds somewhere above 20, which meant hospital visits became part of his routine rather than a turning point. Each time he came back outside, walking the same streets around Fort Greene, Myrtle Avenue, and nearby projects, his reputation grew stronger, since surviving that kind of violence made people look at him differently. Folks around the neighborhood started treating him less like a regular hustler and more like someone you couldn't take out, no matter how many times you tried, which gave him a presence that traveled far beyond his size. That reputation didn't just come from numbers alone, since people who actually saw him after those incidents noticed how quickly he returned to the same corners, moving with the same confidence that got him into those situations in the first place. Stories circulated through Brooklyn and into Queens about attempts on his life that should have ended everything, yet somehow didn't, which turned his name into something closer to a warning than just an identity. Older heads would mention him when talking about risk, while younger guys saw him as proof that fear wasn't necessary if you moved a certain way, which only added to the myth building around him. Over time, that image started working in his favor, since anyone thinking about going at him had to consider the fact that others had already tried and failed multiple times. Still, even with all that talk about survival, the bigger question stayed sitting under the surface, since surviving something repeatedly doesn't mean the situation itself has changed or slowed down in any real way. People who followed his movements knew there were too many enemies stacked up across different blocks, different hustles, and different personal situations for things to stay the same forever, even if it looked that way from the outside. That tension between what people believed about him and what was actually building around him created a gap that nobody really addressed at the time, since the focus stayed on what he had already survived rather than what could still happen next. At some point, that gap started to matter more than the legend itself, since the same pattern that kept him alive also kept him in reach of people who wanted him gone. So the real questions weren't just about how he kept surviving all those attempts, but also about who kept coming after him across different years without stepping back, which pointed to something deeper than random street conflicts. There was also the issue of why none of those earlier attempts worked the way they were supposed to, even when they involved guns, close-range situations, or planned setups that looked solid on paper. Then that leads straight into the moment in Crown Heights, since something about that night worked in a way all the others didn't, which shifts attention toward what exactly changed at that point. When you line everything up, it starts to look less like luck running out and more like a situation finally reaching the right conditions, where survival stopped protecting him and started setting him up instead. To understand how Kelvin Martin reached that point, it helps to step back into New York City during the early 1970s, when the environment he was born into already carried problems that shaped everything around it long before he made any choices of his own. He was born on July 24, 1964, in the South Bronx, during a period when entire sections of that borough were being burned down, abandoned, or left to fall apart as landlords walked away from buildings they no longer wanted to maintain. By 1975, the city itself faced financial collapse, with unemployment rising, services getting cut, and crime increasing across neighborhoods that once had more stability, which created a setting where families struggled to stay grounded. That kind of environment didn't just affect adults trying to hold things together, since it also shaped kids growing up inside it, especially those dealing with unstable homes from an early age. Kelvin's early life reflected that instability clearly, since his parents separated when he was still young, which led to a situation where he was sent across the city to live with his grandmother, Irene Martin, after his mother reportedly put him on a bus with a note pinned to his shirt. That move didn't create long-term stability either, since the arrangement eventually shifted again, placing him in Brooklyn during his teenage years, specifically in Fort Greene around the Raymond V. Ingersoll houses. By the time he arrived there around 1979 or 1980, Fort Greene had already changed from what it used to be decades earlier, since economic decline, rising drug activity, and reduced city attention had reshaped the area. The housing projects became crowded with families dealing with similar struggles, while surrounding streets carried reputations tied to violence and open drug markets that operated without much interference. Myrtle Avenue, one of the main strips in that area, had already picked up the nickname Murder Avenue from locals, which reflected the kind of incidents people saw regularly, rather than exaggerations meant to scare outsiders. Police presence existed, but many residents didn't rely on it, since response times, trust issues, and corruption concerns made official help feel distant in everyday situations. At the same time, the street economy became a real option for teenagers looking to make money, since legal opportunities remained limited and immediate needs didn't wait for long-term solutions. Younger guys would start with small roles like running errands, watching corners, or moving packages, which slowly introduced them to larger operations over time without needing a formal entry point. Kelvin entered that environment during his early teens, which meant he didn't step into something new so much as he moved into something already active around him, where small crimes like purse snatching, chain grabbing, and basic robberies served as early steps into a larger system. What made his situation stand out wasn't just participation, since plenty of teenagers were involved in similar activities, but the way he carried himself during those moments, choosing to operate openly rather than hiding his identity like others did. That approach built a different kind of reputation early, since looking victims directly in the face while taking something created a message that extended beyond the act itself, shaping how people viewed him afterward. Over time, that pattern reinforced itself, since each successful move without consequences added to the confidence that guided the next one. At the same time, he connected with the 5% Nation, a movement founded in Harlem in 1964 by Clarence 13 X, which gave young men a framework for identity, knowledge, and personal understanding that carried influence across New York street culture during that era. Kelvin adopted the name Shamik during that period, showing that his life included more than just street activity, even though those different influences didn't pull him away from what he was already doing outside. Instead, they blended into the same path, since the environment around him didn't separate those worlds the way people might expect from the outside looking in. By the time those influences settled into place, his direction wasn't defined by one moment or one decision, since it came together gradually through everything happening around him. By the time he stepped outside as a teenager, the street already had a place waiting. By the time Kelvin Martin settled into Fort Greene during his early teenage years, the shift into street activity didn't come through one big decision, since it developed through small actions that kept stacking over time. At around 14 or 15, he started with minor robberies that matched what many young guys around him were already doing, including purse snatches, chain grabs, and quick strong-arm moves on Myrtle Avenue or nearby subway stops. Those early situations worked as a kind of learning phase, since each attempt showed him how people reacted, how fast things could change, and how to move in and out before anyone could respond properly. What made his approach stand out early wasn't just participation, since others were doing the same thing, but the way he carried himself during those moments, which created a different kind of pressure on whoever stood in front of him. Instead of covering his face or trying to stay anonymous like most others in that line of work, Kelvin chose to let people see him clearly, which turned each robbery into something more personal for the person on the receiving end. When he stepped up on someone, he looked directly at them while taking whatever he came for, which added a layer of intimidation that went beyond the act itself and stayed with the victim afterward. That method worked in his favor over time, since people who recognized him understood that reporting him could lead to further problems, which made silence a safer option in many cases. As that pattern continued, his name started circulating around the neighborhood, not just as someone who took things, but as someone who didn't bother hiding while doing it, which built a certain kind of reputation early. That reputation grew through repetition, since each successful move reinforced the idea that his way of operating carried fewer consequences than expected, especially in an environment where witnesses rarely spoke up. Over time, people started associating his presence with a certain level of risk, which meant that even before he made a move, his reputation could influence how situations played out. That kind of recognition created advantages, since fear often did part of the work before anything physical happened, reducing resistance in some cases while escalating tension in others. As those moments added up, the gap between him and others doing similar things started to widen, since his approach shaped how people viewed him long before his name reached its later level of notoriety, Alongside that street activity, Kelvin became involved with the 5% Nation, which introduced him to a different framework for understanding identity, purpose, and self-awareness within the context of New York street culture during that time. Through that connection, he adopted the name Shamik, reflecting a shift in how he saw himself beyond just the environment he was moving through daily. The teachings emphasized knowledge of self, discipline, and a sense of elevated awareness, which gave many young men a structure that wasn't provided by traditional systems around them. For Kelvin, that influence existed alongside his street activity rather than replacing it, which created a balance that looked stable from the outside but carried tension underneath. That internal contradiction showed up in how those two sides developed at the same time, since the discipline and identity he gained through the 5% Nation didn't pull him away from the streets, but instead existed within the same lifestyle. He could study lessons, adopt a new name, and build a sense of purpose, while still stepping outside to take part in robberies that relied on intimidation and force. That overlap wasn't unusual in Brooklyn during that era, since many people moved between similar spaces without separating them into clear categories, which made it harder to see where one influence ended and another began. Over time, that combination didn't slow him down, since both sides contributed to how he carried himself, building confidence that translated directly into his actions on the street. As his activity increased, it didn't take long before law enforcement caught up with him, since repeated involvement in robberies raised attention within a precinct already dealing with high levels of crime across Fort Greene. His early arrest came as part of that pattern, marking his first direct encounter with consequences that came from operating so openly in public spaces. Those moments introduced him to a system that many around him had already experienced, where getting picked up became part of the process rather than an endpoint that forced change. Instead of stopping his movement, those arrests showed him how the system worked, what to expect, and how to move through it without losing his place in the street environment. That first exposure to consequences didn't shift his direction the way some might expect, since the environment he returned to remained the same, with the same pressures, opportunities, and expectations waiting outside. Once he came back, the same patterns resumed, but now with a better understanding of what could happen and how to handle it, which made his next moves more calculated. The experience didn't break his momentum, since it added another layer to how he operated, reinforcing the idea that setbacks could be temporary rather than permanent. The first time he got locked up didn't slow him down, it refined him. When Kelvin Martin got sent to Rikers Island during his teenage years, he entered a system that operated under its own rules, especially inside the C-74 juvenile wing, where younger inmates were housed. That section of the facility during the early 1980s carried a reputation for constant tension, since overcrowding, limited supervision, and daily conflicts made it one of the roughest environments for anyone coming in without preparation. Fights happened often, sometimes over small issues that escalated quickly, while makeshift weapons turned ordinary objects into tools for survival when situations got out of control. In that kind of setting, staying safe required more than just physical strength, since awareness, alliances, and timing played a bigger role in determining who lasted and who didn't. Kelvin adjusted to that environment fast, since his background already prepared him for pressure, though Rikers added a new level that forced him to sharpen how he moved. Inside C-74, hierarchy developed naturally among inmates, with respect tied to how individuals handled themselves during conflicts, how they communicated, and who they connected with over time. Younger detainees watched each other closely, learning from those who carried themselves with confidence while avoiding those who showed hesitation under pressure. Kelvin built his position within that structure by staying consistent in how he reacted to situations, which helped him avoid becoming a target while also gaining recognition among others who paid attention. That recognition mattered, since being known inside that space could either protect you or place you at risk, depending on how it developed. Over time, his presence inside C-74 became part of his overall growth, since surviving there required a different level of discipline than what the streets alone demanded. Beyond the day-to-day survival, Rikers functioned as a place where connections formed between individuals who would later shape different parts of Brooklyn's street landscape. Kelvin crossed paths with James Roseman, who would later become known as Jimmy Henchman, a figure who transitioned from street life into the music industry while maintaining ties to the same environments they both came from. He also connected with Calvin Bacote, who earned the nickname Calvin Klein due to his clothing choices, and would later rise as a major figure within Brooklyn's drug economy. Those relationships didn't stay limited to conversations inside a facility, since they created links that extended beyond that moment and influenced how each person moved after leaving. Being in the same space allowed them to exchange ideas, observe each other's approaches, and build familiarity that carried forward into future interactions. That exchange went deeper than surface-level connections, since each individual brought different experiences and perspectives that contributed to how they understood the street world they were part of. Kelvin absorbed information about organization, structure, and long-term thinking from those interactions, which shifted how he approached his own activities compared to how he operated before getting locked up. Instead of focusing only on immediate opportunities, he began to see how coordination and planning could expand what he was already doing, allowing him to move with more control over situations. Those ideas didn't come as formal lessons, but through observation, conversations, and watching how others thought about power and influence within their environments. Over time, that shift in mindset became one of the most important changes that came out of his time at Rikers. When Kelvin eventually left Rikers Island and returned to Brooklyn, he stepped back into Fort Greene with a different perspective than the one he had before entering, since his experiences inside had reshaped how he approached everything around him. The streets were still the same, with Myrtle Avenue carrying its reputation, the projects holding the same pressures, and opportunities remaining tied to the same systems that existed before. What changed was how he interacted with those conditions, since he no longer moved through them in a reactive way, but with a clearer sense of direction shaped by what he learned inside. That shift allowed him to take what he was already doing and push it further, using structure and coordination to build something more organized than his earlier efforts. He didn't come back the same kid, he came back with a plan. When Kelvin Martin returned to Fort Greene after his time on Rikers Island, the shift in his approach showed quickly, since he no longer moved alone or relied on scattered opportunities the way he did before. Instead, he began pulling together a group of younger guys from the projects around the Raymond V. Ingersoll houses, creating a crew that would later be known as the Brooklyn Zoo. That name carried weight beyond just sounding aggressive, since it reflected how chaotic and unpredictable their movements could be, while also signaling that the group operated as a unit rather than individuals acting separately. People in the neighborhood started recognizing the name through patterns of activity rather than announcements, since the same style of robberies kept showing up in different locations, tied to the same faces. Over time, the Brooklyn Zoo became less of a label and more of a presence that people associated with a specific way of operating across Brooklyn and parts of Manhattan. The structure behind the crew developed through repetition and adjustment, since Kelvin used what he learned on the streets and inside Rikers to organize how they approached each situation. One of their main targets became nightclubs during the mid-'80s, especially spots like the Latin Quarter on West 48th Street, Harlem World on 116th Street, and venues around Brooklyn such as the Empire Skating Rink and the Brooklyn Armory. Instead of rushing into random situations, they studied how crowds moved, focusing on moments when people were distracted, tired, or packed together without much space to react. The exit crowd strategy became central to their approach, since large groups leaving a club created pressure points where movement slowed down and awareness dropped at the same time. Within that environment, chains, bracelets, and bags could be taken quickly, while the confusion made it harder for victims to identify exactly who was responsible. That system worked efficiently, since the crowded exits provided both cover and opportunity, allowing the crew to blend in immediately after making a move without drawing direct attention. Victims often realized what had happened only after they had already moved away from the entrance, which reduced the chance of immediate confrontation and allowed the crew to disappear into the surrounding streets. Over time, this method turned into a routine that could be repeated across different locations, creating a consistent flow of results that reinforced the crew's reputation. The money and items taken during these operations were divided or sold through connections that didn't ask questions, which kept the cycle moving without interruption. As this pattern continued, their presence became expected in certain environments, even if people couldn't always identify them directly. Beyond clubs, the Brooklyn Zoo expanded into other areas where cash moved regularly, including dice games that took place in open spaces across the neighborhood, where players gathered with money visible and attention focused on the game itself. Kelvin and his crew would step into those situations at the right moment, using timing and positioning to take control before anyone could organize a response, which made those spots consistent targets. They also focused on ATMs and check cashing locations, where individuals leaving with money became immediate opportunities if approached correctly. These locations carried different risks compared to clubs, since they involved smaller groups and less confusion, which meant their approach had to adjust based on the setting. Even with those differences, the underlying idea stayed the same, since the goal was always to identify moments where control could be taken quickly and maintained long enough to complete the move. As their operations grew, Kelvin pushed into areas that carried higher stakes, including robberies targeting individuals involved in the drug economy, where larger amounts of cash and product could be taken in a single move. That shift increased the level of risk significantly, since those targets had access to their own networks and resources, making retaliation more likely and more organized than what came from civilians. Despite that, Kelvin continued moving in that direction, treating those opportunities as extensions of what he was already doing rather than a separate category of activity. Each successful hit added to the crew's reputation, while also building tension with people who had the capacity to respond in ways that went beyond isolated incidents. Over time, that balance between reward and risk became harder to manage, though it didn't slow down the pace of their operations. Within all of this, Kelvin maintained a personal code that shaped how he approached different situations, even if that code wasn't always consistent across every account from people who knew him. Some sources suggest he avoided targeting women during robberies, while others describe moments where unpredictability overrode any fixed rules, which added to the uncertainty around how he would act in a given situation. That unpredictability became part of his identity, since people couldn't always anticipate his decisions, making it harder to prepare for encounters involving him or his crew. At the same time, his presence stood out physically, since at around 5'2" and 120 pounds, he didn't match the image most people expected from someone leading that kind of operation. Despite that, the way he carried himself, combined with visible weapons like a .357 Magnum and a Colt .45 in his waistband, created a different kind of impact that didn't rely on size. Walking through the neighborhood with those long-barreled revolvers clearly visible wasn't just about protection, since it functioned as a statement that reinforced everything people already heard about him. That visibility signaled confidence and readiness at the same time, making it clear that he wasn't trying to blend in or avoid attention, which shaped how others reacted before any direct interaction took place. Over time, that image spread across Fort Greene and into surrounding areas, building a mix of fear and respect that worked in his favor during operations while also increasing his exposure. People recognized him, talked about him, and adjusted their behavior based on the possibility of encountering him, which extended his influence beyond direct actions. At this point, he wasn't just part of the street, he was shaping it. By the mid-'80s, hip-hop in New York had grown beyond block parties and small gatherings, since artists were now filling venues across Manhattan and Brooklyn while building identities tied closely to how they presented themselves in public. Places like the Latin Quarter on West 48th Street, Harlem World on 116th Street, and the Roxy became central spots where performers, DJs, and crowds mixed in tight spaces that carried both energy and tension. Within that scene, appearance mattered almost as much as music, since artists used clothing, jewelry, and overall style to show status, success, and influence among peers and fans. That visibility created a setting where recognition came fast, though it also made certain individuals stand out in ways that extended beyond admiration. For someone like Kelvin Martin, who already understood how to read environments for opportunity, this shift in culture created a new type of target that fit directly into his existing system. Jewelry during that period carried a meaning that went beyond decoration, since gold chains, rope chains, and large medallions functioned as visible proof of success within the hip-hop scene. Artists like LL Cool J, Rakim, and members of Houdini wore pieces that were intentionally noticeable, reflecting both personal identity and financial status at a time when those signals mattered heavily within the culture. Those items didn't just represent wealth, since they also showed position within a growing movement that was still defining itself in public spaces. For Kelvin, that visibility worked like a form of information, since identifying who carried value became easier in environments where people displayed it openly without hesitation. As a result, his target selection started shifting toward individuals within that scene, not out of interest in the music itself, but based on the opportunities those settings presented. One of the most widely discussed incidents tied to Kelvin Martin involved LL Cool J, whose real name is James Todd Smith, during the early stage of his rise in the mid-'80s. According to multiple accounts from the neighborhood sources and later documentary interviews, Kelvin approached him in a parking lot outside a White Castle location in Brooklyn, where the encounter turned into a robbery involving a gold rope chain. That situation reflected the same approach Kelvin used elsewhere, since he relied on direct presence and intimidation rather than surprise or concealment, which fit his established pattern. While LL Cool J was already gaining recognition at that time through releases like I Can't Live Without My Radio, the setting itself showed that even public figures could become targets if the conditions aligned correctly. That moment became one of the most repeated stories connected to Kelvin, though it existed alongside other incidents that received less attention but followed similar patterns. Encounters involving Houdini also appear in multiple accounts from that period, though the details vary depending on the source, which makes it harder to pinpoint exact sequences or outcomes tied to specific individuals within the group. What remains consistent is that Kelvin and members of the Brooklyn Zoo moved within the same environments where Houdini performed or appeared, which created opportunities for interactions that sometimes turned into confrontations. Those situations reinforced the idea that the line between the hip-hop scene and street activity wasn't clearly defined, since both existed within overlapping spaces during that time. While some stories about those encounters may carry exaggerations added over the years, the broader pattern shows that Kelvin's presence in those environments wasn't incidental, since it followed the same logic he applied everywhere else. Over time, separating confirmed facts from street talk became more difficult, since both contributed to how his story spread across different circles. At the same time, Kelvin developed a relationship with Eric Barrier, known as Eric B, from the duo Eric B and Rakim, which placed him inside the very culture he was also moving through as an opportunistic figure. That connection started around 1986, growing through shared spaces and mutual familiarity, eventually linking Kelvin to the Paid in Full Posse, a group associated with Eric B and Rakim during that period. The posse included several individuals connected to both music and street environments, creating a network where those worlds overlapped without clear separation. Kelvin's inclusion in that circle showed that his presence within hip-hop wasn't limited to targeting individuals, since he also participated in the same spaces alongside them. That dual position created a situation where he could be seen both as part of the scene and as someone operating within it for different reasons. His appearance on the back cover of the 1987 album Paid in Full by Eric B and Rakim stands as one of the clearest examples of that overlap, since it placed him visually within a project that would later be recognized as one of the most influential releases in hip-hop history. In that image, he stood alongside figures connected to the music, which created a contrast between how he appeared publicly and how he operated privately at the same time. That moment didn't receive widespread attention immediately, though it gained significance later as people revisited the connections between different individuals present in that scene. Being part of that imagery didn't change his activities, but it added another layer to how his story was understood, since it showed that his role within that environment wasn't limited to one side. That dual identity became one of the defining aspects of Kelvin's presence during that period, since he existed both as someone recognized within the hip-hop community and as someone who used that same space to carry out his own operations. He could stand alongside artists in one setting, then move through a crowd targeting individuals in another without shifting his approach or identity in any obvious way. That overlap made it harder for people to place him within a single category, since he didn't fit neatly into either side, which added to the uncertainty surrounding him. Over time, that complexity contributed to how his reputation spread, since people described him through stories that combined both sides of his activity rather than separating them. As those stories circulated, his name grew beyond Fort Greene and reached other parts of New York, carried through conversations, music circles, and street networks that connected different boroughs. Some accounts stayed close to verified events, while others expanded into versions shaped by retelling, though both contributed to how his image developed over time. That mix of fact and exaggeration created a narrative that felt larger than individual incidents, since it reflected how people understood his presence rather than just what he did. As visibility increased, so did attention from those who watched his movements for different reasons, which gradually shifted how he was perceived across those overlapping worlds. The more visible he became, the harder it was to ignore what he was doing. By the mid-'80s, the name 50 Cent had already attached itself to Kelvin Martin across Fort Greene and surrounding neighborhoods, though the exact origin of that nickname never stayed tied to a single clear explanation. One version suggested that he would rob anyone, regardless of how little they had, meaning even 50 cents could be enough to make someone a target if the opportunity presented itself. Another account pointed to a dice game on Myrtle Avenue, where he reportedly walked in with 50 cents and left with several $100s, turning a small amount into something larger through confidence and timing. A third explanation focused on his physical build, since standing around 5 feet 2 and weighing close to 120 pounds made the nickname feel like a reference to being a $50 in size. Over time, all three versions circulated at once, which meant the name carried multiple meanings depending on who told the story and where it was being repeated. That kind of nickname did more than label him, since it shaped how people understood his identity before even meeting him, creating expectations tied to what they had already heard. In neighborhoods where reputation traveled faster than direct experience, a name like that functioned as a summary of behavior, letting others form opinions based on stories rather than encounters. As people repeated those stories across Brooklyn, into Queens, and through parts of Manhattan, the name 50 Cent started to represent more than just a person, since it stood for a pattern of actions that others recognized without needing full details. That spread happened through conversations in barbershops, street corners, and clubs, where information moved quickly and often changed slightly with each retelling. Over time, the name became a point of reference within those spaces, used to describe situations, risks, or examples of how far someone could go within that environment. Many of the stories tied to that name carried details that sounded extreme, though they stayed believable within the context of what people had already seen or experienced around him. Accounts of him walking openly with long-barreled revolvers, taking items in crowded areas without hesitation, or surviving multiple attempts on his life added layers to how those stories developed. Some versions likely stretched beyond what could be confirmed, though they remained grounded enough to feel possible, which kept them circulating rather than being dismissed. That mix of fact and exaggeration worked in his favor, since uncertainty made it harder to separate what he had actually done from what people believed he could do. As a result, his reputation continued expanding, shaped by both real events and the way those events were described over time. At the same time, there was a difference between how the public saw him and what his day-to-day reality involved, since the image of someone untouchable didn't fully reflect the risks building around him. While people outside his immediate circle viewed him as someone operating without consequences, those closer to the situation understood that each move added pressure from individuals who had their own reasons for wanting him gone. That gap between perception and reality created a situation where his confidence continued growing, supported by past outcomes that reinforced the idea that he could handle whatever came next. Over time, that mindset shifted from confidence into something closer to believing he could move through any situation without being affected by it, which influenced how he approached decisions moving forward. As that belief settled in, it started shaping his behavior in ways that reduced caution, since past survival became a reference point for future actions rather than a warning about what could happen. Situations that might have required more awareness or preparation were approached with the same level of ease that had worked before, which made him less responsive to changes happening around him. That pattern didn't stand out immediately, since it developed gradually through repeated experiences that seemed to confirm his assumptions, and that belief would follow him into situations he should have avoided. By the time Kelvin Martin reached his early 20s, the number of times people had tried to kill him had already become part of his story, though the details of each incident didn't always stay consistent across sources. What remained clear from multiple accounts was that he had been shot or targeted in at least 9 separate situations across Brooklyn during the mid-80s, with those incidents leaving him with more than 20 bullet wounds over time. These were not minor altercations that ended without consequence, since each situation involved real attempts on his life, often at close range and in environments where survival depended on seconds. After each incident, he ended up in hospitals like Kings County or Woodhull, where doctors treated injuries that would have ended most people's movements permanently. Despite that, he kept returning to the same streets that produced those situations, which made each recovery feel less like an ending and more like a reset. Those hospital visits became a repeated cycle that shaped how people viewed him, since seeing someone come back outside after being shot multiple times changed the way others processed risk. Each return added another layer to his reputation, since surviving once could be seen as luck, though surviving again and again suggested something different to those watching closely. People in Fort Greene, Crown Heights, and nearby neighborhoods started talking about him in ways that moved beyond normal descriptions, using his survival as proof that he operated on a different level than others in similar positions. That shift didn't happen all at once, since it developed through each incident being added to the last, building a pattern that felt harder to explain as time went on. Over time, those events stopped being separate moments and turned into a single narrative that followed him wherever he moved. Community reaction played a major role in shaping that narrative, since people who lived around those areas adjusted how they spoke about him based on what they saw and heard. Early reactions focused on the danger surrounding him, since being targeted repeatedly made it clear that his lifestyle carried serious consequences that could land him at any moment. As those attempts continued without ending his life, the tone shifted gradually, moving from fear into something closer to respect mixed with disbelief, since surviving that many situations felt outside normal expectations. Younger individuals started referencing him as an example of toughness, while older ones spoke about him as someone who had pushed past limits that others didn't return from. That combination of perspectives kept his name active in conversations, reinforcing the idea that his survival meant something beyond coincidence. Part of that survival came from practical adjustments, since Kelvin owned and regularly wore a bulletproof vest during that period, which added a level of protection in situations where gunfire became unavoidable. That vest wasn't always visible, though people close to him knew it played a role in how he managed risk, especially after experiencing multiple incidents that showed how quickly things could turn. Even with that precaution, not every situation allowed for full protection, since close-range encounters or unexpected angles still resulted in injuries that required medical attention. Still, having that layer of defense contributed to his ability to return from situations that might have ended differently without it. Over time, the vest became part of his routine rather than a reaction, showing that he understood the environment he was moving through even while continuing to operate within it. As those experiences stacked up, his tolerance for risk started increasing in ways that changed how he approached everyday situations, since repeated survival reduced the impact of danger on his decision-making. Moments that might have caused hesitation earlier no longer carried the same weight, since past outcomes suggested he could handle whatever came next without needing to adjust significantly. That shift showed up in how openly he moved, how often he placed himself in situations where conflict was possible, and how little he changed his routines despite knowing the risks involved. Over time, caution became less central to his behavior, replaced by a confidence built on previous experiences rather than current conditions. That pattern didn't stand out immediately, though it became clearer when looking at how his actions evolved across those years. The key idea behind that shift comes down to how repeated exposure to danger changes perception, since surviving multiple threats can reduce the sense of urgency that usually drives people to adjust their behavior. Instead of seeing each new situation as a separate risk, it starts to feel like a continuation of something already managed, which lowers the psychological barrier that would normally create caution. For Kelvin, that meant approaching future situations with the same mindset that had worked before, even when circumstances changed around him. Over time, that approach created a gap between how he perceived risk and how it actually developed, which made it harder to recognize when things were shifting in ways that required different responses. By the time people stopped asking if he could be killed, the question became, who would finally do it? By late 1987, the number of people who had reasons to go after Kelvin Martin had grown beyond isolated individuals, since his activities over several years affected multiple groups operating across Brooklyn. Drug dealers who had been robbed repeatedly saw him as more than a nuisance, since losing money or product disrupted operations that depended on consistency to stay profitable. Rivals who crossed paths with him during different situations carried their own grievances, while victims who had been targeted earlier added to a broader pool of resentment that didn't disappear over time. Each of these layers built pressure in different directions, which meant the threat surrounding him didn't come from one place, but from overlapping interests that eventually aligned. That alignment marked a shift away from scattered retaliation attempts, moving towards something more coordinated than what had come before. Instead of relying on chance encounters or open attacks, the focus turned toward creating a situation where his defenses wouldn't activate the way they had during earlier attempts. That shift required understanding how he moved, who he trusted, and when he felt most relaxed, which meant the solution had to come from within his own environment rather than outside of it. People involved in those discussions understood that reaching him directly carried too much risk, though using someone close to him could bypass that problem entirely. Once that idea settled in, the direction became clear, since the plan depended on access rather than force. That decision led to Julio Acevedo, also known as Waymo, who, at 18 years old, had connections to Kelvin's circle and enough familiarity to approach him without raising suspicion. Acevedo wasn't chosen randomly, since his position within that environment made him someone Kelvin would recognize and accept without hesitation during a normal interaction. The situation around Acevedo, however, changed quickly once pressure was applied, since individuals behind the plan used threats and leverage tied to his family to force compliance. According to later statements, he was kidnapped, beaten, and given a clear ultimatum that placed his cousin's life at risk if he refused to cooperate. That kind of pressure created a situation where the decision wasn't based on loyalty or personal choice, but on immediate survival under conditions that left little room for resistance. Once those terms were set, the plan moved forward, with Acevedo placed in the role that made everything else possible. That created a psychological tension that sat at the center of what followed, since Acevedo had to balance his connection to Kelvin with the reality of what would happen if he didn't follow through. On one side stood the expectations tied to loyalty within their environment, where turning on someone from your own circle carried consequences that extended beyond the moment itself. On the other side stood direct threats backed by violence, where refusing to act could result in immediate harm to both him and his family, which made the situation harder to navigate. That conflict didn't play out publicly, since from Kelvin's perspective, nothing appeared out of place when Acevedo approached him. Instead, it remained internal to Acevedo, shaping his actions while leaving Kelvin unaware of what was being set in motion around him. Kelvin didn't see it coming, since the entire setup relied on familiarity and routine, rather than anything that would trigger suspicion based on his past experiences. Acevedo was someone he knew, someone who had been around him before, which meant their interaction didn't require the same level of caution he applied in other situations involving unknown individuals. That familiarity reduced the need for preparation, including the decision not to wear his bulletproof vest that night, which marked a significant departure from his usual habits. The situation didn't stand out as unusual, since visits, conversations, and movement within that circle followed patterns that felt normal at the time. By keeping everything within those patterns, the setup worked without needing to force a situation that might have raised concern. On the night of October 20th, 1987, Kelvin was staying at his girlfriend Precious Golston's apartment in the Albany Houses in Crown Heights, a location that fit into his regular movement across Brooklyn. Around 10 p.m., Acevedo came by presenting himself as he normally would, which allowed the interaction to unfold without tension from Kelvin's side. After a brief exchange inside the apartment, they left together, heading toward the stairwell that connected the floors within the building. At that point, Kelvin still had not put on his vest, relying instead on the same sense of comfort that came with being around someone he trusted. As they moved down through the building, the environment remained quiet, with no immediate signs that anything was about to change. Somewhere between the upper floors and the 7th floor landing, the situation shifted in a way that none of the previous attempts had managed to achieve, since Acevedo acted within the space created by that trust. He pulled a gun and fired multiple shots, hitting Kelvin in the head, chest, and stomach at close range, which left him collapsing within the stairwell where the attack took place. The location limited outside visibility, reducing the chance of immediate intervention, while the timing ensured that few people were present to witness the moment directly. After the shooting, Acevedo left the scene, while Kelvin remained on the landing until a resident discovered him and contacted emergency services. The ambulance transported him to Kings County Hospital, where he would remain for several days as doctors attempted to stabilize his condition. The immediate aftermath didn't produce the same kind of public reaction seen in earlier incidents, since the circumstances surrounding this shooting carried a different weight once people began understanding what had happened. News of the event moved through the neighborhood, though the details about who was involved added a layer that changed how the situation was perceived compared to previous attempts on his life. For the first time, the focus wasn't just on whether he would survive, but on how the situation had unfolded in a way that bypassed everything that had protected him before. That shift marked a turning point, since the method used in this case addressed the one area where he had remained vulnerable throughout everything else. The same trust that kept his circle strong became the only way in. After the shooting on October 20th, 1987, Kelvin Martin was taken to Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn, where doctors worked to stabilize injuries that had already pushed his body beyond what it could handle before. For 4 days, he remained there under medical care, with moments where it seemed possible he might recover again, since he had survived similar situations in the past. On October 24th, 1987, that pattern ended when he died from hemorrhaging, marking a conclusion that many in the neighborhood had considered unlikely despite everything that came before. Word moved through Fort Greene and Crown Heights, though the reaction didn't follow one clear pattern, since some responded openly while others stayed quiet, processing what it meant without speaking much about it. Within his family, the loss carried a weight that extended beyond public perception, since those closest to him understood the difference between the stories people told and the person they knew directly. In those street discussions, the reaction leaned less toward shock and more toward recognition, since many already knew the number of conflicts surrounding him made an outcome like this inevitable at some point. Attention also turned toward Julio Acevedo, who later faced legal consequences tied to his role in the shooting, adding another layer to how the situation was understood over time. The legacy that followed stayed connected to fear, stories, and influence, since his name continued circulating through conversations about street life and early hip-hop culture long after his death. That legacy didn't present survival as protection, since it showed how surviving multiple attempts could delay an outcome rather than prevent it entirely. When returning mentally to that stairwell in Crown Heights, the final detail remains tied to how the situation unfolded, since everything that came from outside never ended him. He survived everything around him, but the threat that ended him was already inside his circle.